we should be encouraging all Americans to share their story, especially from an immigrant perspective. Where, this is a country of immigrants.
Hi, welcome back to Let Me Ask You Something, the weekly podcast where I, MD Pittman, talk to everyday ordinary people about something extraordinary in their lives. Now this week I talked to Jeffrey Lee, and he's got a few things going on that we chat about. One of them being how he trains first-time political candidates, and also his ultramarathoning, which I still don't get. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Jeffrey Lee. Welcome to our 16th episode of Let Me Ask You Something, the podcast where I talk to everyday ordinary people about something extraordinary in their lives. But today we have somebody who's got a number of extraordinary things in his life. Jeff Lee, he's into ultramarathoning. He was quoted in the New York Times regarding anti-Asian hate, and he trains first-time political candidates, which that's one of the things I really want to talk to you about, because as a political reporter, local politics, I feel I can do that too. But let me ask you something, Jeff. What's a global connector?
First off, Mike, thanks so much for having me. And a global connector, I think it means a few things. First, I feel fortunate to have been blessed to have had a life to travel to 85 different countries. And each of those experiences gave me the opportunity to meet folks way more interesting than me, but certainly folks with different skills, abilities, talents. And what I've sort of learned in my career is, yes, it helps to be book smart and it helps to have certain skills to have, but one of the greatest treasures I've seen has been the ability to connect, people in different circles of life together. And that might be, based on business collaborations, that might be on different writing opportunities, that might be on even, getting music or even matchmaking in relationships. And certainly that, the lines on a map. Yeah. And I think that's been one of the greatest ways I've been able to give back. And I always tell friends, I might not know something, but I've got friends that are way smarter and way more interesting than me to connect them to. And for that, I've been grateful. So that's why I define it as global connector, because, the world is actually quite small. And, yeah. You only live once unless you're Buddhist or Hindu. So you should really make it count to connect people. I think the world can be a little lonely. So anything we can do to sort of foster and bridge folks that, deep down would be able to create something really neat, that's something I'm all for.
Great. Now, I want to get in this. Talk about your work here. You have a very interesting job. So talk about what you do.
Sure. So right now I'm at a fintech startup called Rhino, and Rhino is trying to change the way the renter sort of takes on their experience of getting into affordable and stable housing. So right now, Mike, you've got about 110 million renters in the United States. It's an interesting and complex time because you also have millions of Americans who, after July 30th, will probably be evicted from their homes, right? Yeah. The cost of living for most Americans in terms of savings, very few, I'd say less than half, have more than $490 of savings right now. Yeah. So imagine you get evicted and then you want to move your family into another apartment, right? And you might be able to pay 1 month's rent, but what about security deposits? And your security deposit generally is 1 month's rent. Yeah. And that money is generally right up front. Those are upfront costs that sort of serve as barriers to stable housing. And unfortunately, I don't know about you, but I don't know who has $1,000, $2,000 laying around. And so what Rhino does is they say, hey, listen, instead of putting up the $2,000 up front, why don't you pay Rhino a premium of, let's say, $20? And that serves in lieu of month to month, so for the duration of your lease. And so at the end of the year, you paid us the $20 a month. You haven't levied a giant hole in the wall. Your rent on time to your landlord. At the end of it, you're good. That money didn't have to exchange hands. Now we keep the premium, so that $20 times 12, $240 we would keep. But I think that's probably for many American families a better solution than the $2,000 they probably don't have. So even if you're losing 240 up front, the difference of the 1760, if you're a working family, you would actually use that money for your groceries, your car payments, your gas, repairs, kids tutoring, whatever that might be. So, think of it like in healthcare, right? When you get a healthcare plan, Mike, you have options, right? You have all these different options, and you're a grown up. You weigh the pros and cons. You make a choice. When you go to rent a new apartment, you only have one option generally in your security deposit, which is you pay the security deposit or you don't get the rent there. That is your option. So Rhino is trying to offer a similar option. Say, hey, listen, here's your two options. You can either have that $2,000 or you can pay us a premium. We act as a guarantor to the landlord. So if something happens, the landlord files a claim to us and we sort of assess the veracity. So the property manager gets their guarantee, which is the whole point of the deposit. And then there's a lot more, flexibility in terms of how we can figure things out, right? So in my mind, you get two things. You get, number one, the consumer has more choice. That's good. And the landlord has security. That's good for them. So it's sort of this unique sort of, matchmake here between the property manager, the renter, and us.
Yeah. Now, this plays into what you also do is to help train first-time political candidates, because this is a big issue. This is a big political hot button issue. How do you educate first-time politicians on this? And then let's also get into a little bit about what you do and how you got into that.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, having conversations with first-time candidates, I will say, after a piece I wrote in April in Politico, sort of highlighting my challenges in politics, it resonated to, I think, more audiences than I intended to. I heard from journalists, I heard from complete strangers, I heard from decision makers, but I also heard from civic community folks who were very interested more and more in running for office, and frankly, didn't know where to start. They had been involved in their communities across the country, but had never, really gone into the depths of, how do you do media training? How do you fundraise? How do you stump? How do you talk to a constituent? How do you strategize? How do you perform, a policy manual? And there are many, I want to say, sort of training programs out there for first-time candidates. I think what resonated for people reaching out to me, and the reason why I do it and how I do it differently, is really two things. Number one, focusing on candidates who clearly are not first choices for parties. And I say this in that, a lot of our politics, the parties decide who runs.
Yeah, and there's the next in line mythology.
Correct. And I'm sure in Ohio it's a similar way, right?
Yes.
Very much so. The second is I am looking for candidates who are very reluctant to do it. And I say this because my belief is, at least from working with political principles, if people are really excited about running and think they're going to be incredible with sort of no shame, maybe those are not the people you want in office. I mean, there are studies out there that say that, women are like 10 times, you have to ask them 10 times to get into the arena. I think for communities of color members, I think that's similar. And so those are the candidates I really work with, right? So women and first-time candidates from communities of color who are underrepresented generally. And, the more, polished sort of, stereotype candidate, right? The lawyer who went to some fancy law school.
The chiseled jaw.
The chiseled jaw or the flowing whatever. That's less interesting to me. I'm really in the business of trying to find somebody who's truly humble, somebody who can connect to different audiences, and frankly, who is somebody that surprises you. Because what I've learned in politics is when your opponent underestimates you, you have a great opportunity to win. And I would say heading into the 22 cycle coming up, there's definitely a lot of candidates out there who are starting to file their papers, who I don't think people give them much chance, but I'm certainly excited about seeing what happens. And sometimes it's not just about winning, Mike, right? Sometimes it's about advancing ideas, highlighting values, talking about a specific thing you're passionate about, and also telling your story with, again, in America, in 2021, we should be encouraging all Americans to share their story, especially from an immigrant perspective. Where, this is a country of immigrants, and I think there's so many opportunities for other voices to be in the arena that maybe haven't really shared the limelight.
Yeah, because we'll have a very interesting Republican primary for Rob Portman's Senate seat,
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Senate seat, because we just had J.D. Vance announce
Yep.
that he's going to run.
Mm-hmm.
So that is going to be basically who's going to be the Trump candidate, because we have at least three of them, maybe I think four, that are considered Trump candidates. So, but yeah, so that's for a discussion for another time. But what's the one thing that you tell first time political candidates? What's the one piece of advice you give them? What's the main piece?
Yeah, I think I would say it's tied for first. There are two things.
Yeah.
Number one, understanding why you're doing this, because
Okay.
the sacrifice you need to be doing is whatever you think it is. It's times 10.
Yeah.
The scrutiny is significant. The lack of sleep is brutal. The pressure on your family is something that's really
Yes.
unprecedented, especially the higher up you run. I mean, that U.S. Senate seat, I mean, in Ohio, for example, the stakes couldn't be higher in a 50-50
Yeah.
Senate, right? In one of the most swingiest states in the country, right?
Exactly.
That's fascinating. And you can only imagine the millions of dollars that would be coming in, not just within the state, but out from outside the state.
Yeah.
So I, have to say, like, what's your North Star? Like, why the heck are you doing this? Because sort of like, with marathon running, at miles 22, you're probably asking yourself, why did you do this? And I think so much of the case, there's some similarities. What I would say tied for first is don't be apologetic about who you are.
Yeah.
I mean, I think voters and yourself, frankly, your team of people will resonate with somebody who can be brutally honest. And I think the constituents that, candidates I work with are trying to court. Brutal honesty is actually a rare thing in politics, right?
Yeah.
And I think that does connect to not just passionate activist voters, but also maybe folks who wouldn't vote otherwise that found some inspiration by your candor. And obviously, you can say what you want about certain political candidates in their day. If there's sort of a perception that they're speaking in an unpolished manner, there is some charm to that in this system. Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at a lot of some of the very extreme on one side or the other candidates, and choose your political party. They're elected because they speak to that base, which is kind of interesting nowadays, because before it was you have to be extreme to win the primary, but moderate to win the November election. Now that's not so much the case anymore.
Yeah, and again, it gets back to, how people tell their story, I would say. And yes, don't get me wrong, like, having positions on issues is important and you will be scrutinized for those positions. But at the end of the day, people remember you based on the story and how likable you are. And those things are not necessarily policy driven, aspects, but it might be the perspective of how you speak, where you connect with a constituent, and frankly, how often you're willing to sort of go to, the most local of levels, right? And whether that's the county fair or the library or wherever, people appreciate the effort. And they might not love you, but they'll appreciate that you're hustling, because at the end of the day, the voters are your boss. So, you're sort of interviewing for a job, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's the way to approach it personally.
Yeah, county fairs are big, especially in Ohio. That's where all the politicians, if you're serious about running, you're at the county fair.
Absolutely. And and obviously you've got to pick your sports teams well in advance, right? And if it is certain teams, then you need to tell people up front on that. So your allegiance has mattered all aspects of
well, in Kentucky, you cannot be a Louisville fan or a University of Kentucky fan. I think one politician said that he was both. Not so much.
I tell folks, like, if you're going to be in Kentucky, Murray State, Western Kentucky, I don't think people will hate you for it, especially if it's basketball season. I think people appreciate that, it might not be as sexy as the Wildcats or the
or the Cardinals. That's a good safe bet. That's a politician bet right there. Murray State.
Yeah, that's right. Go Racers.
So with the politician, I wanted to get one more last thing on that before we move on. I would have a third piece, which is kind of interrelated. Own up to whatever indiscretions, honesty. I mean, they're going to get dirt on you. Totally. Expect it. Be prepared for it. But that kind of goes with what your first two is the kind of the honesty and speak the truth. So don't try to hide or walk around or talk around the issue. Be direct.
I think totally. I think confronting it head on, showing remorse or, showing where you grew as a person is important. I'd like, personally, I think we're all human. No one's perfect. What people want is not perfect. What people want is somebody that can evolve and grow. I think that is, you want to connect to most people's angels. And I think most people will give them benefit of the doubt, especially if you have brutal candor, right?
Yes.
If you had, a marital issue, or if you had your business fail or whatever, if you think about it, the American story is so much about redemption and second chances. And I think most of the electorate overall have that in their heart. That's something I've certainly seen, whether that's in California or Georgia. I mean, certainly there's that connection.
So you had mentioned I mentioned it first, and then you kind of referenced it. Ultra marathon. How on earth do you get into ultra marathoning?
Well,
that's brutal.
Yeah, again, stupidity. Common sense is not so common, is what I've learned. But Mike, when I first got into running, it was originally as a health issue. So way back in the day, I started running because I was having significant health issues. The doctor told me, "Hey, you'll be lucky to make it to 40 at the rate you're going." I was massively, I was pushing almost 300, right? That wasn't great. It was in my mid-20s. You kind of think you're going to live forever, right? Yeah, and I started, sorry?
Bulletproof.
Yeah, you think you're immortal. And let me tell you, as someone who's closer to 40, I definitely don't feel that immortality. And I remember, signing up for the gym for the very first time, and we're getting on the treadmill. I see a very attractive person next to me. So, I don't know gym etiquette, Mike. It's the first time really in a gym, and I start talking to her like it's nothing. And I'll go her speed. I don't know what the numbers mean. And about 5 minutes in, I see stars, and I throw up all over her shoes.
Way to make a first impression, Jeff.
Yeah, it was not good. But I'll tell you, right, one of the proudest things I've ever done, Mike, was go back to the gym the next day. There were 7 treadmills. I got on treadmill 4, and treadmills 1 through 3 and 5 through 7. Next to me had people. They all left because they saw what happened. They saw Sir Chunk-a-Lot there going and didn't want to, be involved. And, I started running faster, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 9 minutes, 11 minutes, 5K, 10K, half marathon. And in 6 months, lost 130 pounds, made it, ran, a sub-4 marathon, which was a goal I was trying to get, raised quite a bit of money for charity to support brain cancer, which my godfather passed away from. And then a year later, qualified for the Boston Marathon. So I had this sort of Cinderella 2 years. And then at Boston, okay, so Boston is like the Super Bowl of running. At Boston, mile 3, take a bad step. My knee is in pain. I go to the tent, and she says, "Hey, listen, it's not permanent damage, I don't think, but it's gonna be uncomfortable the whole way." But it's the Boston Marathon, Mike. So I finished the race. Had a torn meniscus, which in knee pain universe is deeply uncomfortable, but not horrific.
Not I had a torn ACL, so I get it.
That's way worse. Torn ACL, way worse. But torn meniscus running 23 more miles is not fun. Especially in the Boston course, it goes like a fistful. It goes down and then it's uphill through 4 hills. When I had the surgery, I was out for about 9 months, and it became pretty clear I wasn't going to have my speed back. But I thought, maybe I can go further than I could. And that, April 20.
Well, hold on. You tear up your knee and you want to go more.
Yeah, because, running for me, Mike, was like true freedom, because it was for the first time I was sort of going outside of my body, if that made sense, right? I had spent my whole life, being sort of an out-of-shape kid. And what I noticed and what I realized is the energy I had, the passion I had for things was being hindered by my physical limits. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't have limits. And even if I had this bad knee issue, I was going to overcome it. And the thing is, the marathon, right, at some point, and I think most marathoners will tell you this, it's either about the speed or the distance or the degree of difficulty of the course. After a while, you run a few of these and you start thinking, what else is out there? I mean, it's sort of like, think about it like man going to the moon, then man wants to go to Mars. And, there's that aspect of that. And so, so I ran my first 50-mile race, 9 months after the surgery, and finished. And same thing at 50 miles, you're thinking, okay, what about 100K? And then eventually, ran and completed, 5 100-mile races.
5 of them? Holy crap.
Yeah, I mean, in the Wisconsin forest, in the Georgia plains, and twice in the Arizona desert. And I'm really, and I'll tell you my little secret, Mike, in these races, besides amnesia, which is critical. When I run these hundreds, I of course have a lot of music on me. You've got all your stuff, you have to pack your water, your food, whatever.
Yeah.
And I have a little card that I hang on to my water bottle, and it has a name and a number. And the number is the mile, the name is the person. And it's something I think about at each mile. And the idea is that there's someone who helps you along the way. And the blessing, again, of being a global connector is you've got a lot of people to think about. And if you get into trouble, Mike, let's say you're at mile 65 and you're not feeling so good, I tell every person on those cards in advance that if I'm feeling bad and I need a distraction or a pick-me-up or a pep talk, I will call them. And I will call that person, and they're going to march me through until I get to the next mile. And it's an incredible way of knowing that you're not alone, because so much of these races, you're in the middle of nowhere by yourself, right?
And you're running for so long, too. I mean, you're running how many hours in a day? Because it's a 2-day, 100K is like 2 days.
Yeah, so in these 100-mile races, generally you get about 30 hours to finish. So you'll start at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. on a Saturday, and then you'll finish around 11 or noon at the latest the next day on Sunday, right? Mm-hmm. And so some races are different. Some races are 48 hours, some are 36 hours, depending on the degree of difficulty. Yeah. But all of mine have been 30-hour finishes. And again, it's you're not trying to win. You're trying to survive. Survive and win, right?
I know, but that's a long time, or that's a long distance in a short amount of time, it seems.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of the allegory of life, right? You need to keep pushing forward, and like anything, a bad or negative experience, you can overcome it, and you sort of can move on. I mean, imagine all the things you've had in your life where things weren't great, and then a little time goes by, and you're okay again. Like humans are built for two things: one, hating change, but embracing a new status quo. And so if you can get through the change and get over it, you can adjust pretty quickly. Like
that's so contradictory as humans.
They're so weird. But it's true though, if you think about it, right? Like think about how much people, deal with hardship and how crummy it is, but then they overcome it.
Yeah.
And then they totally have forgotten about it. Yeah. It's such a fascinating thing.
Yeah, because I actually did probably about 15 years ago, I did a story on a guy from, it was Point Pleasant, Ohio. I'm failing to remember his name because, well, it's been 15 years, and he ran one of the I think it was the Arizona, what was it? What's that desert out there? I'm blanking on it. I can't think of it. I forget the name of the desert, but anyways, this desert out there. He ran it, and I think he ran it for back-to-back years, and his training, because he had to prepare for the heat. He worked from Point Pleasant in Ohio, which is kind of maybe about 45 minutes northeast of Cincinnati. And he worked in Dayton, which was about a 45 to an hour drive for him. He would crank the heat up wearing garbage bags so he could be prepared for the heat. And then he would wear garbage bags, run it, because there was a walking path around the hospital. He worked at the hospital. He would run on the treadmills at the hospital or around the walking path outside the hospital. I mean, that's right. I mean, did you do anything like that to train for something, especially in the desert?
Yeah, you basically, when I was living in Sacramento, where the temperatures can be 110, it's a dry heat, thankfully. I would run at the hottest times of the day. I mean, and frankly, bring less water than you should, because you need to acclimate. It's all about acclimation, right? Like if you were running a race with hills, you probably could run some hills, right? If you're running flats, you probably can run flats. But I will say, at the end of the day, the famous philosopher Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And you really don't know what you're made of until you feel like garbage and you want to quit. That's the first real test. And whether the distance is 5 miles or 100, there's a moment where you want to puke and you feel awful and you're asking yourself, why the heck are you doing this? But again, as human beings, we're built to overcome.
Yeah, and it was Death Valley. Was it? It was. I think it was. I think it was. There's a place called. I had to Google it because it was
Yeah.
driving me nuts. I think it was the Badwater
Yep.
Marathon.
Yes. Badwater. Yeah,
Yes.
that's 135 miles in Death
Yeah.
Valley. Yeah, that's
Yes.
no
Yeah.
bueno.
He did that 2 years in a row.
Mike,
He didn't finish either year.
Mike, the temperature on the asphalt is so hot, you only can run on the painted white line, or your shoes will melt. That's how hot it is there.
That's just
And
nuts.
I think
I don't
that's
get it.
crazy. I
I
think
don't
that's
get
crazy.
it.
I don't get that one either.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about this New York Times. You were quoted in the New York Times regarding the anti-Asian hate.
Mhm.
How did you get? I mean, did a reporter reach out to you because of your position? Because you have a not necessarily a political position, but you worked for I think the state of California.
Yep.
Or can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that? How did they get in touch with you and all that?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess let me tell you about my I guess political background. I mean, I have
Yeah.
worked in public policy for the past 20 years,
Hmm.
but have served at some of the highest levels for the federal government, the obviously international arena, but also for the state of California. I worked for Governor Jerry Brown of California for 5 years.
Hmm.
As his international affairs person, but also as his cabinet person. And the best way to describe a cabinet person is the person that has to do the stuff when the bill becomes a law. That's the best way to describe the cabinet. And I dealt with, a range of issues from agriculture to veterans issues to military affairs, to all the disasters responses, right?
Yeah.
Fires, floods, droughts, unfortunately, mass shootings, cyber attacks, these
You
other
have to
things.
be kind of an expert in everything, just about,
Well,
or
I
close
think
to it, or at least know where the smart people are.
I'd like to say, yes, two things. One, you should know people way smarter than you in the room,
Yes.
thankfully. And two, you don't have to be fluent in the language. You just have to be able to tell people where the bathroom is and most. And that's certainly how I felt on those issues. But again, these were things I was passionate about. My parents are farmers. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Like, these were issues that were important to me. And, when I worked for Governor Brown, I definitely developed a range of policy expertise. And when COVID-19 happened, I started speaking up about it, for really 2 reasons last year. First was in my last work trip, I got spit on in an airport by a complete stranger and got told to go back where I came from. I don't think she meant California.
Yeah.
So I don't think that was implied. I get that Californians get a little bit of hate, that I get, but not in that context. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's not the first time I've been spit on, but the first time where I really felt less human was when about a dozen people around me saw what happened and looked the other way, pretended like it didn't
Mhm.
matter, that I didn't matter. That was one. That was March of 2020, just before the country sort of buckled. And
Yeah.
the second was, my parents are in southern Georgia. They run a free range organic chicken farm, 200,000 birds at any given time. They're proud Georgians. They sound Georgian. They are Georgian. They work with their local community. They work with local business people. They break bread. And at the height of the pandemic, at the end of March of 2020, when things really got bad in Georgia, it was one of the worst hit places on earth. It was New York, Italy, and southern Georgia, a home that people went to a funeral, all got sick and died. And that was when things were really bad. And my parents were in communities that were affected. Contractors and folks they worked with were affected. They were
Yeah.
okay. But when that happened, my parents experienced more anti-Asian hostility. And eventually, this was in early August, some folks they did business with told them, like, listen, we like you, but we can't do business with you anymore because you gave us the virus. And never mind that my parents are Vietnamese Americans, which is its
Yeah.
own thing. Never
Right.
mind that they've worked in this community for 20 years. Never mind that, they were, they, treated their neighbors with, with the golden rule, as we should,
Yeah.
that their standing was arbitrary and conditional because of being scapegoated for something they didn't participate or were a part of. And
Yeah.
those 2 experiences, Mike, forced me to do something that I've been spending my whole life running away from, which is talking about being Asian and talking about why it's important, to highlight what immigrants contribute to the community. This is a long-standing issue of what Asian Americans unfortunately do, which is they try to not rock the boat. They try to be quiet, try to get through the day. And unfortunately, you're kind of conditioned that way. Also, it was doubly tough for me because in politics, when you work in politics as a staffer, your whole goal is to not be in the headline. That is your whole goal, right? I mean, when enterprising reporters like yourself ask questions, you answer questions in the most boring way possible so it doesn't get recorded. That's exactly the reason. And suddenly I found myself feeling this pressure to speak, at least not on behalf of, Asians, but at least about my parents. And so what I did at the end of August, I wrote a small op-ed, my first op-ed piece in the Albany Herald, which has a distro of 30,000. And talked about what immigrants were contributing during COVID-19. They were small business owners. They were supporting healthcare as first line and frontline workers, right? But also that these communities were supporting R&D for a future vaccine, which came. And that's not something we should, we don't talk about that enough, right? Yeah. And so, these things allow for us to have a normal life again. But at the time, immigrants were getting a lot of crud, particularly Asian ones, unfortunately. And again, there's sort of this misperception that Asians have it great. And what I would tell folks is that that's not true, and it's largely because Asians aren't correcting the record. And so I spoke up, and two things happened. One is that the piece got some attention, and I was surprised. Two, some people had conversations and made apologies. That was surprising. And so what I realized was that we do have a voice, and it can matter if you speak with passion and you're honest and you back it up with facts and evidence. And that's how I started writing. So from August of 2020 to now, I've been writing. I usually write 1 or 2 pieces a month. But there was a stretch where I was writing a lot, really focused on the most marginalized communities. So whether it was rural communities, whether that's veterans, whether that's immigrants, whether that's seniors, right? I think we can all agree these are folks we really should care about, and maybe the government service delivery needs to have more focus on these groups, women, so on, childcare. And the New York Times ended up finding me largely from really 2 places. One was this Politico piece I wrote in April, and 2, a number of quotes that had happened in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and a number of local regional papers, so the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Orlando Sentinel, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the San Diego Union Tribune. So when you put it all together, after a while, as you know, being in the journalism scene, when you're looking for a diverse, interesting source, you generally are looking in the pieces and the beats, right? And people saw me more and more, and I sort of came on the scene like a phantom, because prior to August 2020, I hadn't written a single thing for public consumption. Yeah. And so just, coming out in a few weeks will be my 36th piece. And and that's, something that I wouldn't have done, but I really do view the Asian hate issue as a life and death issue, Mike. So I don't feel like I have a choice at this point.
Yeah. Now, I have a friend of mine who I met on TikTok, of all places. I joined TikTok because
you're hip.
Yeah, I'm hip. I joined it because I wanted to see what my daughter was doing on there.
Oh my gosh, it's terrifying.
She doesn't do much. She just more watches things and she's into Percy Jackson, and there's like a Percy Jackson like of TikTok. Well, I found quickly the dads of TikTok. So I came and befriended who is a former and it was actually episode 2 of my podcast, Hula Ramos. He is a Filipino American, and he talks about his I think he calls it a Mexipino family, because his wife is Mexican and his kids are Mexipinos. And so he basically has a podcast about his life. It's a daily podcast, and he just talks about it because he was a DJ in San Diego until the pandemic, and then he lost his job after 19 years. But he talks a little bit about that. He's active on all those social medias, and I cannot imagine, especially befriending Hula, knowing him over the several months. I mean, I consider him a pretty good friend, and I'd be pissed off if I saw that let alone to somebody I didn't know, I'd be pissed off, especially if I saw it happening to a friend. So
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I think each of us as individuals know right and wrong. The issue is in a group setting, right? And so that bystander syndrome that happens, and I'm sure you've seen, and I'm sure your audience has seen, the clips of, Asian grandmas being beaten up, and then everyone's just watching. And that's the issue, right? And so I encourage. I've had conversations with policymakers, with Fortune 500 companies, and I said one of the most important things you need to be doing is having thoughtful education and training on how to give people the tools to handle a situation like this, where some horrible thing happens, you're in shock, but you want to respond as a bystander. And there's a way to do that in an artful and thoughtful way where, number one, you don't get hurt, and number two, someone else doesn't get hurt. So, this is something that, again, I think the individuals all want to do the right thing. The problem is if people are all sort of letting this stuff go, the hate act is bad, but an environment that allows for the hate to happen is way worse. And that is something, whether it's about your friend or about me, it's scary to know that in those situations, sometimes it's not because people want it to happen that way. It's because they don't know what to do in that situation, right? So we have to give our angels the right sword and shield to come in that situation, rather than what ends up happening is people just look around and they say, well, it's not my problem. It's pretty crummy. And unfortunately, then what happens is people think it's okay to let that happen. So then other people copycat and do that.
That's a domino effect. Yeah, it's a sorry, not my problem. Sucks to be you type of thing. Well, no, it sucks, period. And it shouldn't happen. So step up if you see it. I want to end on a little bit lighter note because that was pretty heavy right there. I want to talk about this, and I'm going to link to this, and I'm going to link to all some of the articles you sent me and the stuff here on the show notes. But that was a pretty sexy Runner's Digest, or was it Runner's World? Photo. Talk a little bit about that piece, because that was a few years ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I told you, right, when I first started getting into running, it was originally to really work on my health. And, I think in Runner's World at the time, so Runner's World, for, the audience who maybe don't know, it's sort of the gold standard of sort of running magazines. Like if you're training for a race, you'd read Runner's World to prepare for your race. And, what was interesting to, I think, the running community around my story was three things. One, most people sort of lose the weight in a longer period of time. Two, that's true, but they sort of run a time that's kind of so-so. I had been running faster times. And then three, the combination. So how quickly, how well, came out of nowhere, and then ran a Boston qualifying time in basically a year and a few months. That is sort of unheard of. And
that was 3:10, right? That was 3 hours, 10 minutes.
3 hours, 10 minutes. Which
that would take me. That would be my 5K.
I doubt that. I am sure if you were in a situation where you need to run, you would gladly do that and hop fences, whatever it would take. But again, getting back to it here, I think you need to have inspiration, like we were talking about earlier. And I wanted to have control of my life, Mike. I never felt like I had control, and I will tell you that when my dad's best friend, my godfather, when he passed away, he had two regrets in his life. Number one, he never asked out his high school sweetheart. And he said, Jeff, if you get the chance, you should just ask somebody out, because you never know. And that's totally true. And that's what I definitely did that. And I got to tell you, I didn't do as well as I thought I would. But then it spurred inspiration. The second is his last marathon before he died was 4:01. And he said, if I could do life over again, I would have worked harder and ran under 4 hours, Jeff. And so when I started training, I wrote under 4 hours on my shoes, and that was my motivation every day. Yeah. And we raised $25,000 for cancer, and I had friends all around the world, because global connectors, sort of rooting on and giving money, and frankly also supporting what I was trying to do, because I basically had to really take the reins of a life that wasn't very disciplined, and I had to force myself to sleep. I had to force myself to give up a heck of a lot of drinking I love doing. And I had to really tell myself, okay, no more pizza and chicken wings, which I love. Yeah. It was horrible. But my view was, if I could run and run for him, then I could do it. right? And again, it gets back to motivation. Like, why do you run for office? It's for your community. Why do you write the pieces you do, right? To educate, to inform a citizenry that deserves the truth, right?
Yeah.
Why we fight hate? It's because we want everybody to be treated equally and fairly, and now nobody should be less than human, right?
Yeah.
So these are sort of things with the running. It also reminded me that anything really is possible. You just have to put your heart and head into it, have a game plan, and then respond when you get punched in the mouth. You can be prepared. That's my running story.
Great. Well, that's a great story to end on. Jeff Lee, thank you very much for being on my podcast. That was a pleasure. This was fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's such a pleasure.